Hey, SL. Thanks for inviting me. I am ready to go anytime you are. I'm here in the heartland of Oklahoma in the United States where it's just after 10 p.m. So I'm staying up late with you tonight. What time is it there in India?
So it's now just before 9 a.m.
An early morning space for our early
Yeah,
risers.
exactly. Exactly.
Thanks for hosting this. Thank you so much.
Sure. Well, thank you for joining. I think it's going to be a really fascinating spaces.
Me too. This is one of my favorite subjects. I love to talk about the CIA and their secrets.
Awesome, awesome. So there are only a few topics that are always like guaranteed to be popular. One is the Nazis, and then the other is the CIA. So, and then you put them together. It's like a fantastic topic. You can't go wrong.
Well, I've spent many years. I'm a historian and a journalist, and I love to go through declassified documents, the stuff that a lot of people don't have the time to do, to wade through thousands and thousands of pages in the National Archives. But I love that stuff. I live for that. So there's
Yeah.
nothing more interesting to me. And so, just to start off, the writing that I've done on this subject, and I posted some of it down in the Purple Pill. If you guys want to take a look at some of my Twitter threads about it with links to the actual documents, and I've also posted a link to my podcast series called Hidden History Revealed, where I explain the documents and kind of walk you through them and show you the key documents that were kept from the public. It's so important to stress that the US government never wanted us to know, and they certainly didn't want our Cold War enemies, especially the Soviet Union, to know what we were actually doing in our collaboration with Nazis, former Nazi war criminals from Germany, from Ukraine, from Belarus, right after World War II. And this started even before the war was over, guys. That's the most shocking thing. Our story really begins in 1945, just towards the tail end of the war. And so obviously they wanted to keep this a secret. And so it took us almost 60 years to learn all that the CIA was actually up to. And it's shocking how they kept that from us. It wasn't until after the Cold War in the late 1990s that Congress passed a law called the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. It was passed in 1998, and it's a fascinating story, but just behind the passage of the law itself and how we got these documents in the first place. That's a whole nother story that we cover in the podcast, Hidden History Revealed. And we tell you the story about the efforts of one man, a man named John Loftus. He was a Department of Justice Nazi hunter back in the 1970s. His task was to locate former Nazi war criminals that were living in the United States and deport them back to their countries of origin. These were war criminals who escaped prosecution at Nuremberg, and they should have faced the Nuremberg prosecutors, but they had some help getting away from the MI6 in Great Britain, from military intelligence, and from the CIA here in the United States. They were shepherded. They were often given new passports, new identities, new names, and they were allowed to escape to other countries around the world to find safe harbor. And they found safe harbor in Britain, in parts of Europe, but a lot of them came to Canada, to the United States, and surprisingly, a lot of them took refuge in the Middle East, which is something that you and I talked about last week, SL, when we did an interview together. How, of course, there was an Axis Arab alliance during World War II. And so after the war, many former German Nazi war criminals and a lot of the Ukrainians, the Banderites, actually went to the Middle East because there was a new war about to start there. Of course, in 1948, when Israel became a nation state, as you know, 5 Arab countries attacked and invaded the new country of Israel, and they were allied. They had a lot of help from their former Nazi collaborators. So, in a way, it was sort of keeping World War II going. They just moved it over to the Middle East and wanted to keep it going over there. So it's all just fascinating. It's fascinating how the CIA found these former Nazis and Nazi war criminals and Nazi scientists, Nazi spies, very useful as they were already planning before the war was over in 1945 to make the focus going after communism. They decided in their infinite wisdom that communism was the greater threat, even though the Soviet Union actually did most of the heavy lifting in World War II on the Eastern Front in Europe. And, the USSR really did the heavy fighting and, of course, suffered the heaviest losses. By all estimates, around 25 million died in the Soviet Union fighting the Nazis. They also inflicted the most Nazi casualties. About 80% of Nazi casualties, of course, were inflicted by Russia. So after the war, even before the war was over in April of 1945, this is where our story really begins. Winston Churchill decided that he wanted to go after the communists. And an incredible betrayal of our ally. Remember, guys, they were our ally. We were fighting together against the Nazis. And so Winston Churchill had this crazy plan that he came up with, and he instructed his military brass to draft a plan which became known as Operation Unthinkable. This was in planning.
So by the way,
Mhm.
I mean, as a Lori, I mean, at that plan, it started like maybe uh, like 2 3 weeks after the death of Hitler, right?
Yeah, it actually started just after the death of Roosevelt. FDR died April 12th, 1945.
Hmm.
And it was almost like, I'm pretty sure that that's what it was. Winston Churchill was waiting. He knew that FDR was on his deathbed. There's no way FDR would have ever approved such a plan, ever, ever, ever. So
Hmm.
it was literally something that could only be done over Roosevelt's dead body. And that's what happened. And so Operation Unthinkable was in the planning stages in those critical few weeks between the death of Roosevelt on April 12th and the death of Hitler on April 30th. And the British military high command was already working on these plans under the orders of Winston Churchill, even though I must say a lot of his own military brass thought the plan was crazy. They thought it was a terrible betrayal of our wartime ally. To turn on our ally and make them an enemy was insane. And I'll summarize for you real quick what Operation Unthinkable was all about, because this is what laid the groundwork for what the CIA would later do when the CIA became a thing in 1947. Of course, in 1945, the CIA did not yet exist. This was done mostly by military intelligence. But Winston Churchill's idea with Operation Unthinkable, and this is the craziest thing you've ever heard, was that he wanted to use Nazi prisoners of war and repurpose those Nazi soldiers and convince somehow the British, the French, and the Americans to join forces with the enemy, the Nazis, and go invade the Soviet Union. And there's
Wow.
more. This gets even wilder. Of course, Churchill was aware of the Manhattan Project and the fact that we were working on the atom bomb. There was actually part of the plan in Operation Unthinkable. They were actually discussing using the atom bomb on our ally, the Soviet Union. This was absolutely insane. And like I say, even his own top military brass, some of them thought this was crazy. They thought that Churchill was a warmonger. And fortunately, I think the only reason that this didn't happen, well, two things. Number one, President Truman, the new president, didn't like this idea at all. He didn't see this as a good idea. Obviously, our troops wanted to come home, and Truman was more focused on winning the war in the Pacific at that point. He figured the European War had been won, and it was all but done except for the signing of the paperwork um, in May of 1945 in Europe. But we still had a war to win in the Pacific. So Truman really wanted to focus over there. He also did not want to betray our ally. And the other reason that it didn't
Yeah, then
come,
also, I mean,
sorry?
sorry. Then also, the Soviet Union was supposed to attack Japan and help the U.S. win the war in the Pacific,
Yes,
right?
that's correct. Stalin did
Mm.
agree to send Russian troops, to send Soviet troops into Japan if needed to help win the war. But of course, as you know, Truman decided against that and decided to use the bomb instead to win that war or to end it in Japan in August of 1945. But something else important happened, of course, in July of 1945. Now, Operation Unthinkable was originally scheduled to begin on July 1st, 1945. But something happened that, thank God, put a stop to the whole thing. Winston Churchill lost the election. And the
Perfect.
new prime minister was having none of it because the British troops had been through hell. They wanted to come home, they wanted the war to be over, and they wanted no part of this crazy Operation Unthinkable thing. But I would call Operation Unthinkable the beginning of the Cold War. It was the first shot in the
Mm,
Cold War, even though it was completely secret and known to nobody outside of Winston Churchill and his very top military deputies. It did not become known to the Soviets, to the Americans, to the public at large, and not to the British public until the late 1990s when the British National Archives declassified the documents. And of course, just like our Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act here in the States, which also became law at about that same time in the late 90s, they waited until the end of the Cold War to release all of this information, and the Soviet Union was no more because they knew that the Russians would obviously be very upset to, by the disclosure of this information. Now, that's not to say, let's be honest, the KGB and the Soviets had excellent intelligence, and they had spies all up inside the English government. So I think they probably knew about Operation Unthinkable through their network of
mm.
spies. I think that certainly Stalin knew that a betrayal was coming. And another thing that Stalin knew was happening, and he tried to warn Franklin Roosevelt about this before he died. There's actually some fascinating letters and correspondence you can read between Stalin and Roosevelt in March and early April of 1945, just before Franklin died, where Stalin is telling him that, and this was news to Franklin Roosevelt, that, hey, some of your military intelligence guys are over there at these displaced person camps and prisoner of war camps uh, recruiting Nazis and getting them out of the camps and trying to bring them into your intelligence services. And Stalin was hopping mad about this, as you might imagine. And so he reaches out through these letters to Franklin Roosevelt and says, "Are you aware of this?" Roosevelt was
Mm.
not only shocked, but he was angry. And he thought that Stalin was lying to him. They had a pretty good friendship going. FDR and Stalin got along quite well. When Stalin told him this, he was hurt and he was shocked and he was angry. And he said, "Joe, I would never betray you. I know nothing of this. This can't be true." And before he could get down to the bottom of it, he died. So then Stalin had to start all over with Harry Truman, this new president that he had no relationship with, no rapport with, no friendship with. And, the obviously the relations between the US and our former Soviet ally deteriorated very quickly after that.
Was there like one main person in the U.S. Who was pushing these ideas? Who was working behind Roosevelt?
Well, we do know that General George Patton was one of the key movers and shakers who wanted Operation Unthinkable to happen. As you know, there's that
Really?
famous quote from Patton that we were fighting the wrong enemy in World War II.
Mm,
He always felt that that communism was the greater threat and that we should have been fighting the Soviets instead of being allies with them. So, of all of the top brass in the military, it was General Patton who was most on board with this Cold War silliness. But MacArthur was against it. MacArthur thought it was crazy. Eisenhower was against it. He was
mm,
not going to betray the Soviets who had fought so valiantly and given so much to win that war. To him, that was anathema. He was totally against it.
yeah. So I think he had a lot of really good things to say about the Soviets fighting
He did.
skills and sacrifice.
He did, absolutely. And,
Yeah.
even as president, later when Eisenhower was elected president, when he followed Truman, he actually had a pretty good relationship with Joseph Stalin, despite the fact that the Cold War was in full swing by the late 40s, early 50s. He was trying his best to calm this down, to tamper down the tensions between our two countries and try to get back to a place where we could, if not be allies, at least not be enemies. But unfortunately,
Mm,
Stalin died in 1953, shortly after Eisenhower took office. Literally a couple of months. I think
mm,
Stalin died in early March of 1953. Roosevelt was, sorry, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, rather, was new on the job. He had just been sworn in. And before he could even have his first summit with Joseph Stalin, Stalin passed away and, of course, was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. So
mm,
unfortunately, that was a missed opportunity. It didn't come to pass. But yes, he had pretty warm feelings for Stalin, whom he had met during the war. They had victory celebrations together in 1945 and drank toasts together, and actually had a pretty good relationship, from what I understand.
mm. Yeah, and then he also brought, Khrushchev in the late 1950s to the U.S. And Khrushchev spent like 2 weeks in the U.S. and he had a really good time.
He did. Yes. There was hope. And there was also hope in 1960 when he was planning to have that summit with Khrushchev. And of course, the U 2 spy plane was then shot down by the CIA. We think that the CIA
Mm,
sabotaged that summit so that Eisenhower and Khrushchev would not have that opportunity to meet each other and actually, again, try to calm this Cold War down. I think that both Khrushchev and Eisenhower saw the dangers of nuclear escalation and possible nuclear war. And in fact, in these declassified documents, I ran across several different programs that the United States government had secretly in the early 1950s and even the late 1940s. Um, uh, Operations where they were seriously considering dropping atom bombs on hundreds of cities across the Soviet Union that would have killed
my
millions
God.
of people.
Mm.
Shocking.
Yeah, and they had these like with detailed maps, and they wanted to drop so many atom bombs and also the hydrogen
Yes.
bombs on the Soviet Union. And then in the late 1950s, they had this plan to drop these nuclear bombs on 1,200 cities in the Soviet Union, on China, and on, uh, you know, Poland, East Germany, and all sorts of places.
That's all absolutely true. Everything you just said is so very true. And it's shocking to find out about it some 50 or 60 years later when we finally got the documents. There had been some rumors that slipped out through the years, but we really couldn't confirm those rumors until we got the hard documents in our hands. And reading those, just your jaw hits the floor that these were actually what they called contingency plans. Of course,
Mm.
some historians try to downplay these operational contingency plans today and say, "Oh, it was just a contingency plan. We were never actually going to do it." But believe me, if they had contingency plans already drawn up, that means they were thinking about it. They were
Mm.
considering it.
Madness. Okay, so now, so going, to Ukraine. Can you tell us a little bit about how the Ukrainians got fascinated by the Nazis when World War II began, or like, did it start even before World War II?
Yes, I think that's a great place to start. We'd have to rewind back to the end of World War One, and after the war, then there was the Russian Civil War in 1919 through about 1921. Of course, there was always that question of Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine and the Ukrainian nationalists who had, you know, their movement had begun prior to World War One. They wanted an independent, sovereign nation state of their own. Um,
Mm.
and during the Russian Civil War, the Ukrainian nationalists and the Banderites, of course, Stefan Bandera, uh, and they were often allied with the White Russians in that war. They participated
Mm.
in many horrific pogroms against Jews and Poles, mostly in Western Ukraine, during and after the Russian Civil War. In 1921 alone, I think they killed some that we know of to this day. The numbers are still not, they're still fuzzy, but around 20,000 Jews in Western Ukraine. They would just ride into town. They would ride into these villages like gangs of armed bandits and slaughter everyone in sight, burn the whole village down, take people out to shoot them in the pit, very much like what we would see later in the Second World War during the Holocaust. Many of those
Mm.
same methods were employed during World War One and after World War One during that Russian Civil War. And there are many historical accounts of that are just so incredibly shocking to read. And when you look into what happened, especially in 1919 to 1921, you can see that it's the blueprint for the Holocaust. It was almost like a miniature Holocaust before the Holocaust, like like they were
Mm.
practicing, just getting warmed up for what they would continue to do in World War II. And of course,
Wow. So what did they have against the Jews and the Poles?
sorry, I didn't hear the question. Did you ask what they had against them?
Yeah. So what was it that drove them to do such of a crazy, violent thing?
That is indeed the question, because that's just not normal. It's a normal thinking people.
Yeah.
What in the world would make you want to do that? Well, much like the Nazis, whom they later, of course, became allies with in the Second World War, the German and Ukrainian nationalist alliance actually began during the Russian Civil War. For a time, parts of Western Ukraine were occupied by Germany for a short period of time around 1918, 1919. That's when these two groups realized that they saw eye to eye on a lot of things. One of the things that they both
Mm.
believed in, of course, was eugenics and racial purity. The
Mm.
Ukrainian nationalists, in the brief periods when they had an independent state, which only lasted a minute um, before they were absorbed into the Soviet Union, they had literal racial purity laws passed. And I've written some threads about that, which I'll try to find and I'll post them under the space. They had some really crazy racial purity laws, no mixing of blood with Jews, Poles, or anyone who's not 100% Ukrainian. It was a little different in Germany. They were more into the Aryan thing, no mixing unless you were Aryan. But it really came down to that basic bigotry. and racial purity.
Mm.
It wasn't so much a religious animus that they had towards the Jews, but they considered them to be an inferior race. And of course, anti Semitism was ripe all across Europe, as we know. They looked upon the Jews as inferior, as troublemakers, as undesirables, and they, didn't want them participating in society. They didn't have equal rights, and they were often targeted for sporadic acts of violence. But in the Russian Civil War and beyond, the violence against them became more organized by these armed gangs of bandits like the Banderites and the OUN, the OUNB, the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council, which was known as the UHVR for short. And of course, these are the exact same groups that later in our story, I'll tell you about how the CIA started recruiting those very same people. Today, we call them the Nazis in
Mm.
Ukraine. It's just a colloquial term that's easy for everyone to understand. But really, that
Mm.
was already there. I often refer to the Ukrainian nationalists as the OG Nazis, the original gangsters, because they
Mhm.
actually predated
Mhm.
Nazi Germany. Remember that these pogroms and the Russian Civil War predated the rise of the Nazi Party. This is 1919,
Mhm.
1920, 21. The Nazi Party didn't even exist in Germany until 1923. No one had heard of Adolf Hitler yet, but this ideology was already there. The violence against Jews, Poles, and other ethnic undesirables was already there. So it was already underway, and this predated Nazi Germany. They later became allies. And to be honest, the Nazis learned a lot from the Ukrainian nationalists. They took a lot of ideas from them. Strange as
Mm.
that is.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So there was this sort of the nationalist, the ethnocentric stuff going on in Ukraine, and then when did they start to align uh, uh, with the Nazi Germany and so I know at some point they joined the Hitler's army, the SS army, and so on, right?
Yes, that's correct. There was already some political alliance happening, but it had to be secret before World War II. But certainly in Western Ukraine, the Banderites, the OUN, OUNB, they were already, they had contacts in Nazi Germany. There was already intelligence being shared. So it seemed inevitable that they would become allies once war broke out. And when it did, in 1941, of course, during Operation Barbarossa, when the Nazis invaded Ukraine, they had lots of willing conspirators in Ukraine, especially in the western part of the country, these Ukrainian nationalists who joined forces with them, helped them,
Mm.
oftentimes in an unofficial capacity. I would say that in a more official capacity, where they were literally drafted into or volunteered to join the Waffen SS, that happened more around 1943. Because by that time, Nazi Germany needed some extra help. But
Mm.
the Ukrainian nationalists were trying to make a deal with Hitler, with the Nazis, that in exchange for our help militarily, we want a state. We want an independent and sovereign Ukraine. That's the whole reason that they collaborated with Nazi Germany. That was their goal, was an independent and sovereign Ukraine. And they felt that if they were allied with Germany, who they felt was going to be victorious, they would be in a better position to get their own independent state. And the Nazis played a game with them, of course. Hitler was the king of lies. He was always promising things that he had no intention of delivering upon. And he promised,
Mm.
or never really promised, but dangled the carrot in front of these Ukrainian nationalists that, hey, if you fight for me and you help us beat the Soviets and, defeat the Jews and eradicate them from the face of the earth and we win the war, yeah, we might give you your state. We might give you statehood. It was never a firm promise, though. And that's why there were at times some breaks in their alliance with the Ukrainian nationalists. The Ukrainian nationalists at times were allies of the Nazis, and then other times they fought against the Nazis. All this during one war, and then they went back to the Nazis. There were times when Melnik and Stefan Bandera were actually locked up in Nazi prison camps. Um, yeah,
Mm,
so it was an interesting alliance how they went back and forth with one another. And then towards the end of the war, obviously Germany was running out of men, the Soviets were starting to get the upper hand. That's when the Nazis let these guys out of prison and sent them back to the battlefield, and the alliance was renewed because he needed them on the battlefield.
mm. So was the Soviet Union really mean to the Ukrainians in some way, or they just wanted their own land and the nation, regardless of what the Soviet Union did to them?
Well, there was an ideological split. The Ukrainian nationalists were opposed to communism. It's one of the reasons they fought with the White Russians in the Russian Civil War. They were trying
Oh.
to, they opposed communism and Bolshevism. They opposed the Bolsheviks. The Red Army was their enemy. And of course, there's the Holodomor famine of the early 1930s, 1932, 1933, where the kulaks and, of course, once again, it's these feisty Western Ukrainians who were, in little pockets fighting the Red Army, fighting the Soviets. These little pockets of violence would break out here and there during those years. And they say, or the Ukrainians say, that Stalin deliberately used starvation against their people to try and eradicate them in the Holodomor famine. Of course,
Mm,
historians dispute that. They still argue that to this day. The Soviets always said that it was just they were rolling out this new collective farming thing. It was new, and that it was not a deliberate famine. They were not deliberately starving the Western Ukrainians and the nationalists.
mm,
But it is an interest. I don't think it's a coincidence that it just so happened to be in those areas that the famine occurred, where these Ukrainian nationalists were trying to fight against the Soviets and the Bolsheviks. So the Holodomor is a whole other story. But yes, it was a very contentious relationship. Of course, Lenin, uh, when he was alive, he is the one who actually gave some semblance of sovereignty to Ukraine by making them an independent Soviet republic. But it was his way, I guess,
mm,
of appeasing them somewhat, thinking that giving them some degree of independence and sovereignty would keep them as an ally of the Soviet Union rather than
mm.
an enemy. But that backfired. Obviously, it didn't work.
Yeah, then he also gave them huge amounts of land, which are now reoccupied by Putin.
Yes,
And basically, Lenin, who did a lot to help Ukraine and to make it a larger country.
that's right. And then again, Khrushchev tried that in 1954 when he gave the Ukrainians Crimea.
Yeah, my God, that was like such a worst decision.
Maybe not his brightest idea.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now we see that. So what happened during World War II, and then so what happens when the war ends in
Yes, let's pick
Ukraine?
up the story there. We'll go back to 1945. I was telling you earlier about how Western intelligence, British MI6 and U.S. military intelligence was, recruiting guys out of these displaced persons camps and prisoner of war camps, anyone who they thought might be useful, intelligence operatives, scientists, uh, you know, some of their most savage war criminals. Of course, we know the story about how they recruited a lot of Germans. But what people didn't know or maybe weren't paying attention to, except hardcore historians like me, was the Ukrainian faction of all of this, and the Ukrainian nationalists specifically. They sort of slipped under our radar. You don't see many articles about it. Historians didn't talk about it, didn't even know about it. A lot of historians didn't know. Even after the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act started to make these documents available in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, I think there just wasn't a lot of interest in the Ukrainians. They were more focused on the Germans, of course. And something I'll point out that's really interesting is at the Nuremberg trials in 1945, 46, 47, they were only Germans that were prosecuted. Not a single Ukrainian was ever prosecuted at Nuremberg, and yet some of the most savage and brutal war crimes of that war were committed not by the Germans, but by the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian nationalists.
Mhm.
They were so bloodthirsty and savage that the Nazis even, went, whoa, you guys are, you're too, you're too brutal for us. Um, they were
Wow.
willing to do the really ugly things that even the Nazis couldn't bring themselves to do, the Germans. And so it's always fascinated and angered me that the Ukrainian war criminals, some of the worst, they're the ones that got away. They're the ones who never faced
Uh,
prosecutors.
why do you think that happened?
I honestly believe that the Western intelligence services felt that they could be useful, and that's a horrible indictment of my own country. And again, it's guys like Alan Dulles who were behind all of this. Alan Dulles was one of the ones who dreamed up this scheme to recruit them. And some of the worst
Mm.
Ukrainian Nazi war criminals, guys like Mykola Lebed, who I talk about a lot in my Hidden History podcast, he was recruited directly by Alan Dulles, who was then, of course, the first CIA director. And Alan Dulles
Mm.
personally brought him into the United States, got him past the immigration services, because, of course, there were laws against that. Like bringing a Nazi war criminal into the United States was going to not be easy. So I have a letter that I've posted down in the bubble down there in one of my threads. You can actually read the letter that Alan Dulles wrote, I think it was in 1951, to the head of the INS, asking them to look the other way on this Mykola Lebed guy and let him come on into the country because he could do a great service to our country in the Cold War, is how it was put to them. Let me just start with, let's start with the beginning of the CIA, right? The CIA was formed in 1947, and the CIA sort of picked up where military intelligence left off in the protection, helping escape prosecution, getting safe passage to other countries. And then when we had the CIA formed, of course, we started bringing these guys into the CIA or brought into the country under the protection of the CIA. And the beginning of this was Operation Belladonna, which started immediately in 1947. I mean, as soon as the CIA was formed, they were already doing this with Operation Belladonna. They had already made contact with these Nazis in Ukraine. And of course, the Nazis in Ukraine also saw this as a win-win. They were keen to ally themselves with the US and Great Britain against the USSR, primarily through this Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council, the UHBR. Um,
Mm.
Now, there's a document from 1947 where we can see it's a CIA report. And in that report, we can see that the CIA was well aware of the known affiliations of the UHBR, specifically the Bandera and the Melnik factions of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, in addition to the
Mm.
Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA. And this document goes on
Mm.
to outline the scale of this UHBR apparatus, which was huge. It was spread out in many countries. They had members stationed all over the world. Countries like they were all over Europe. They were all over the Middle East, in Canada too, which was, of course, later became a hotbed of these Banderites and immigrants to Canada. Many of them were Banderites. As the CIA expanded its operations in Ukraine, they had other projects. Project Aerodynamic, which was known under a
Mm.
variety of different cryptonyms and code names. There was Project Cartel, Project Androgen, Project AE Carthage, and these operated from 1949 until 1970. And then they continued. They were reclassified under other project names like QR Dynamic in 1970, and finally QR Plum, which continued all the way until the end of the Soviet Union and its downfall in 1991. So,
Fascinating
yeah,
names, by the
go
way.
ahead. I'm sorry. I'm just talking a blue
No,
streak. Go ahead.
yeah. So just like the names are very fascinating. I mean, I like aerodynamic and plum.
And belladonna, right? The deadly flower.
Belladonna.
Uh
Yeah,
huh. And these operations,
interesting.
they were
Okay.
coordinated in primarily in Washington and Vienna, Austria, and Munich, of course, West Germany, using the remnants of Nazi German intelligence with a mighty assist from Britain's MI6. It's also important that I stress Britain's role in all of this. It wasn't just the CIA. This was a coordinated effort between MI6 and the CIA. And by the way, the CIA and MI6, they can't claim to be ignorant of what these Ukrainian Nazis had done during the war. They were well aware that these guys were war criminals, murderers, traitors to their country. Their country was the USSR, but the CIA did not care. They were willing to overlook all of their atrocities, all of their war crimes. That's the really shocking part to me. And
Mm.
the network, you think of these Ukrainian Banderite, nationalist groups as sort of being localized to Ukraine. Not true. Once
Mm.
we got the documents from, the CIA, nobody does reports and intelligence and analysis quite like the CIA. These reports are well documented that the Ukrainian resistance movement actually had quite a global network. They were in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Turkey, Yugoslavia, the Far East,
Wow.
Palestine, Egypt, Syria,
Wow.
Lebanon, Rome, Italy, Manchuria, China, France, England, Switzerland, Spain, Canada, all over. France, I think I said France already. And they also had friends in high places at the Vatican, which is really important.
That's amazing.
The Vatican connection is so interesting because you've probably read how the Vatican was involved in creating these rat lines to get these Nazi war criminals out of Europe, out of Germany, out of Ukraine, because they were wanted men, of course. They were being hunted by the Soviets. They were the Nazi war criminals that the Soviets wanted. And had the Soviets caught them, they
Mm.
surely would have been executed or at the very least sent to the gulag for the rest of their lives, probably lined up against the wall and shot. And so the Vatican got them new passports, new identities, arranged safe passage for them because, of course, back then the Catholic Church in World War II was, and really from the very beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Catholic Church was one of the Bolsheviks' greatest enemies. The Catholic Church was committed to stamping out communism. And so supposedly the Catholic Church
Mm.
was doing all this to fight communism. That was the excuse, anyway.
Mm. So, I mean, what was the size of the Ukrainian resistance? Was this like 5% of the population, or 20% of the population?
Boy, that's a good question. It's hard to say with any real certainty because I don't know the exact population of, say, these. I would look at it more geographically. If you were
Mm.
to slice Ukraine right down the middle, eastern Ukraine, the eastern part of the country, was more loyal to the Soviet Union. To this day, it's still
Mm,
very Soviet. Even in the Donbass and in these disputed territories they're fighting over today, in those territories, they still love Stalin. They want to restore the Soviet Union. They want to bring back the Soviet Union. You still see a lot of Soviet flags flying in that part of the country. Still a lot, very communist in that part of the country. And that's historically been the case for a long, long time. It's in the western part of Ukraine where they always identified more for the last 100 years with Europe. They considered themselves
mm,
European, ethnically and politically, which is why that alliance with Nazi Germany made more sense, that the Western Ukrainians would be in bed with the Nazis and the Eastern Ukrainians would be in bed with the Soviets. So I would tend to look at it,
mm,
I can't give you an exact number, I would look at it more geographically. If you were to look at the
mm,
population of Western Ukraine and do the math on that, you'd probably get a better number. The hotbeds were, of course, Lviv, Lvov, Odessa, the major cities in the west, and of course the villages throughout Western Ukraine were hotbeds of Ukrainian nationalism and the Banderites.
mm. So, what can you tell us about Stepan Bandera? Why did he become so popular? What was his skills or personality?
I look at Bandera as kind of the Ukrainian Hitler. Of all,
Mm,
there were many leaders of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, but it was Bandera who became I guess you would call him an icon, and he still is. He's a national hero uh, in
yeah,
Ukraine to this
yeah,
day. They call him a hero of Ukraine.
yeah. I mean, yeah. So they just passed a law a few years ago, like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and they made his birthday the national holiday, and they have his face on stamps. They have statues of Stepan Bandera, like pretty much all over Ukraine now.
That's right. January 1st, his birthday every year.
Mm,
They celebrate widely, especially in the western part of the country, but really, all across the country. Um, and they have monuments to him and postage stamps with his face on them. And in parts of Ukraine, you'll see his picture hanging in government buildings. And the way that they look upon him, even I don't mean to say that today in Ukraine that every Ukrainian is a Nazi. I think that's very unfair and very inaccurate. Not everyone in Ukraine
sure.
is a Nazi. Let's be very clear about that. But even those who are not Nazis, they look upon Bandera and the Ukrainian nationalists as freedom fighters. To them, it was always
Mm,
about independence from the Soviets. And today, they don't want to be gobbled up by Russia. They don't want to be part of Russia. They want to be their own sovereign country. They look at him as the pioneer, the leader
Ukraine,
of that movement.
yeah. So, by the way, well, I went to Ukraine about 15 years ago, and I am dark skinned, but people were so nice to me everywhere, and I didn't see any but Nazism or racism or anything like that.
Thank you for pointing that out. It's really important for people to understand, because there is a mistaken belief that everybody in Ukraine is a Nazi, and it's just not true. There are still pockets, especially in the western part of the country. I mean, in Odessa and in Lviv, you can find swastikas, spray painted on buildings, and they still call Jews kikes, and they're pretty racist. But generally speaking, most folks in Ukraine are wonderful, really good people. And who could
Mm,
blame them for wanting their independence?
mm, yeah. Okay. So now back to 1945, 46. So, well, you had a fun tweet about Stepan Bandera and how he was on the verge of coming to the U.S.
Oh, that's a good story. You want me to tell that story?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Now, this was
Mhm.
actually much later. This was like 1959. This was
Oh, wow.
after, um, the CIA started recruiting guys like Mikola Lebed and Melnick. Lebed was brought into the United States much earlier. I think in 1953 is when he entered the United States. And so, Bandera, he wanted to work for Western intelligence in the 50s. But the
Mhm.
MI6 and the CIA, they were hesitant to bring him in full on board because he was such a lightning rod, so
Mhm.
controversial. They looked at Bandera as too hot to touch. A guy like, Lebed, they could kind of sneak in quietly because not many people knew who he was. But
Mhm.
they sure knew who Bandera was. And they knew that he was one of the most savage and brutal Nazi war criminals with a big name. And so they were kind of touchy about that. So there was shall we say, a negotiation back and forth between Bandera, the MI6, CIA. And originally, Bandera was looking to go to Britain. But I guess the
Mhm.
Britons decided, he's too hot to touch. Why don't you take him, United States? And these documents, these declassified documents in the CIA, they show you that there was a lot of internal debate within the agency about Bandera, whether or not we should work with this guy. And there was a lot of resistance within the agency. A lot of people in the agency didn't like it. They didn't think it was a good idea. They did not want to bring him to the United States. But in the fall of 1959, apparently he was finally approved for a visa to come to the United States.
So at this point, so he was living in Germany, right?
That's right. Yeah, and like a hiding out in the Alps in Bavaria, up in the mountains,
Okay. Okay.
because he was a wanted man. I mean, he was always on the run. He was always
Mhm.
hiding, and he was looking to just get out of Europe and get to a safe
Mhm.
place, which is why he wanted to come here, like his friend Mikola Lebed had done. So in October of 59, he was finally approved for a visa to come to the US. And literally the very next day, on October 15th, 1959, Bandera was assassinated on the streets of Munich the very
Wow.
next day after his visa had been approved. So that just goes to show you how good the KGB was at collecting intelligence. Obviously, they knew that he'd been approved for a visa and that he was about to escape, and they killed him before he got the chance to
Wow.
leave. You probably know that story of sorry, I almost said CIA. It was a KGB assassin. I can't think of his name. I'm blanking on the guy's name who took him out um, with cyanide.
Mm. Wow. Okay. So, and then, so what happened in the 1960s, 70s, 80s? Did the CIA have any success at all, or was it all a big flop in terms of doing something with the Ukrainian nationalists and the neo-Nazis?
To tell you the truth, and the CIA, the documents prove it. Most of these schemes that they had with the Ukrainians were pretty harebrained schemes, to be honest with you. Most of them were failures. They were not the
Mm.
CIA's best moments, to say the least. For example, Project Aerodynamic, which I talked about earlier, the reason that they named it that was this crazy cockamamie idea of taking these Ukrainian nationalists who they'd been arming, training, funding to wage guerrilla warfare with the ultimate goal of regime change in the Soviet Union. They wanted to use these guys and drop them behind enemy lines inside the Soviet Union. Very dangerous mission because they were wanted men. And if they were caught, the Soviets were going to kill them. And that's exactly what happened. They had this crazy idea to bring them in by parachute, to literally airdrop them into the Soviet Union. That's why they called it Project Aerodynamic.
Oh, I
See?
see.
And most of them, the Soviets saw them coming. Literally, they saw them parachuting down in the sky. They knew exactly who they were, they knew exactly what they were doing. The KGB had an excellent intelligence apparatus. And so they were waiting for them. Sometimes they literally shot them out of the sky and they were dead before they hit the ground. But those who did land on the ground from their parachutes were quickly apprehended, arrested, thrown in the gulag, and in many cases, you know, assassinated right there on the spot. So we lost a lot of CIA agents in those operations. A lot of our American CIA agents were also killed in these harebrained schemes. And of course, they killed a lot of the Ukrainian nationalists who were working with the CIA in these operations. So another thing that they had, of course, Belladonna and other projects, they did black propaganda campaigns. Like they set up radio stations, in addition to, of course, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. There was also the Nova Ukraina, New Ukraine, which was kind of an
Mm,
underground radio network meant to put out anti-Soviet propaganda inside the Soviet Union, right? Trying to turn the local population against the government and get them to overthrow
mm,
their own government, right? To do a regime change. And you know, they even had, this is how crazy some of these missions were and elaborate, was that they placed secret agents undercover in like humanitarian organizations, like literally the International Red Cross. So they
mm.
would sneak these guys in behind enemy lines under the guise of being humanitarian aid workers, too. That was another way they did it. And it was just infiltrating inside the Soviet Union. But these were such dangerous missions that these agents were literally given poison, suicide pills to take, so that if they were caught by the
Wow,
Soviets, they wouldn't have to endure torture.
wow. Okay. So then this went on until the end of the Cold War. And then what happened in the 1990s? Because we also see the rise of uh, new far right political parties like the right sector, Svoboda, and the neo-Nazi paramilitary groups, and so on.
Right, right. And of course, you know, it's important to point out that by that time, most of the old guard had died off. You know, of course, Bandera died a long time ago. Mikola Lebed, he lived to a ripe old age in the United States, and he was never prosecuted, never deported. He lived in New York City, ran a anti-Soviet publishing company called Prologue Publishing, which was funded by the CIA, and he was allowed to live out the rest of his life in peace. Most of these guys did just that until they died. But by the time when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, by that time, most of the original OUNB guys were dead. So their sons and grandsons picked up the torch. And
Mm,
that movement never really died. And when the Soviet Union fell, of course, here was that golden opportunity that Ukraine had been waiting for, hoping for, fighting for almost, well, at that point, about 90 years, wanting their sovereignty, their independence. And they got it in 1991. And it
mm,
wasn't long. I mean, I've literally seen video footage from 1991 in places like Kyiv, Lvov, Odessa, where the Ukrainian nationalists were having big rallies. You know, these things that they couldn't do in the Soviet years because, of course, they were banned organizations. They couldn't just rally openly in the streets. But once the Soviet Union fell, they could. And so they were organizing once again and recruiting and training. And our CIA was helping. And you know, we not only sent money. I have in front of me a document. Um, this is from I think I want to say this is the 70s or 80s. Just what we were providing them besides money. This is a wish list, actually, that the Ukrainian nationalists sent to their CIA handlers of what they needed. Things like 12 cartons of cigarettes a month, ration cases, 10 in 1 ration cases, 5 bottles of vitamins, uh, vehicles. They wanted, I think, yeah, a lot of vehicles, equipment, clothing, foreign currency, usually Swiss francs or German marks. Um, and it's kind of interesting. This memo, there's some CIA analyst scribbling in the margin of the document, "What about all this?" Which is kind of funny.
What about all
What
this?
about all this? But it's important. Again, I have to stress that there was resistance to this within the CIA. There were good people in the CIA who thought that this whole thing with the Ukrainian nationalists was stupid. It was a waste of money. It was not going to be successful. And again, most of these operations were failures. And it was just dangerous to be getting mixed up with these former Nazis. Obviously, not everybody in the CIA was crazy about this. And they were concerned about our operations, especially in Poland in the 1980s and the 90s. Considering Bandera's savage slaughter of the Poles for much of the 20th century, that was certainly a reasonable concern. We didn't want to turn these guys loose in Poland, for God's sake, no. So, yeah, I think after the Cold War ended, it just continued to grow and grow and grow in the new sovereign, independent Ukraine, which would then, of course, lead to the Orange Revolution, the Color Revolution of the early 2000s, and eventually culminating in the Maidan coup in 2014.
So it's so fascinating, right? So, I mean, I can see, okay, so during the Cold War and maybe during World War II, they wanted their own country, and so they were aligning with the Nazis. But then once they got their own country, one would think that the Nazism would go away since now they have their own country.
Right. You would think. You would
Yeah.
think. And I think a lot of that did go away. What my contacts in Ukraine tell me is that today the Nazism is the Nazis in Ukraine are actually a very small minority. Probably very much like the United States or any other country where there's, a Nazi element. There's always going to be those neo-Nazis out there who think that Hitler was cool and they've got their Nazi tattoos. But, as the years pass and the generations, you know, change, I think that Nazism has kind of fallen out of fashion in Ukraine. I'd say, like, the majority of Ukrainians are definitely not Nazis, but there's definitely still a Nazi element there. And it's a sizable enough percentage of the population to be concerned about. And a lot of them, of course, are in the military. As we well know, they've got these whole Nazi battalions like Azov, like Right Sector and others. And I personally know Americans who went over there to fight for Ukraine in the International Legion. And they said that in
Wow.
their battalions, yes, they did encounter some Ukrainians who had the Nazi tattoos, who had copies of Mein Kampf in their bunkers, and who were totally into the Nazi stuff. But they also said that, probably under pressure from the West, because it's just not a good optic, that the Ukrainian government and the military has, in the last couple of years since this war began, to root these guys out. And my American friends who were fighting for the International Legion in Ukraine said that some of these Nazis, not all of them, but some of them were literally thrown out of their unit because it just was not a good look and the government didn't want them there.
Yeah. So can you tell us about the 2014 Maidan coup and how it really happened, because the mainstream narrative is so ridiculous. They're like, oh yeah, people just wanted freedom and democracy, and there was a dictator, so the people just rose up and overthrew the dictator for the sake of democracy. But there is a lot more,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right. And once again, it comes back to the CIA meddling and manipulating and funding these Ukrainian nationalists to, throw the Russians out. And as you know, there had been a lot of anti Russian sentiment, especially, in parts of eastern Ukraine. This is where things really boiled up between the old guard Soviets who were still longing for the return of the Soviet Union, the communists, and the more westernized Ukrainians who wanted to crush them, to drive out their culture, their language. It all gets back to that sort of inherent racism in that movement. They always looked at the Russians and the Russian speakers as inferior, racially, intellectually, etc. So that's when you started to have these armed skirmishes taking place. That was going on for years, even before the Maidan coup. But things really kicked off with that Maidan coup. And it was totally manipulated with Western money by the CIA. We did have, there are numerous accounts of CIA assets who were there on the ground taking place, stirring up what started out, I think, as a pretty normal, peaceful protest. But there were
Mm,
agent provocateurs who turned it violent on purpose, right?
mm,
Um, and then, of course, it turned extremely violent, and people were killed in that riot that eventually, succeeded in driving the elected president out of the country, and they installed their puppet. Was his name? Was it Yanukovych?
yes.
Yeah,
He was the one who left the
yeah, it
country.
was Yanukovych who left the country. Sorry, it's late. I'm starting to get my
Okay.
names mixed
Wow,
up
yeah,
now.
so this uh, pretty late for you. Okay, so we'll stop in about 15 minutes.
Sounds good. I'm enjoying this. I'm trying to stay awake because it's just so interesting to me. I love this stuff. But I did want to say that even though all of these CIA documents that I'm telling you about and that I've made this podcast about and written about, even though these were declassified nearly 20 years ago, certain parts are still redacted. It's not fully declassified. And the parts that are
Mm,
redacted are mostly in regards to funding, which is frustrating because it makes it difficult for historians like me to follow the money. Some of the documents that
mm,
I posted in below in that purple pill, you'll notice when you go through them, you'll see, blank spaces almost always involving money. So I don't know why it's such a big deal that to this day they still want to keep the money trail secret from us, but that's just something
mhm.
kind of interesting. And another interesting thing I wanted to point out um, was that Mikola Lebed and Stefan Bandera and their associates, they were actually CIA assets. They had actual CIA code names, guys. They had
Wow.
cryptonyms like Stefan Bandera's code name was Cavatina 1. Mikola Lebed had a
Okay.
CIA code name. It was Cassowary 2. And their associates, like Yaroslav Fedek and other names that I can't pronounce, and Yaroslav Stesko. They had the cassowary cryptonyms like Cassowary 1, Cassowary 2, Cassowary 3, all the way up through Cassowary 27. And the Cavatinas, which was more the Bandera OUNB faction, those were the Cavatina code names: Cavatina 1, Cavatina 2, Cavatina 12. And, again, this is just everything we've talked about tonight, everything I've written about and included in my podcast. It's only a minuscule portion of the declassified documents that we now have from the CIA. And there's still thousands more pages to analyze. I think they're all technically declassified now. But like I said, they're not fully declassified because parts are still redacted. So there's still secrets that
mm,
haven't been fully disclosed, even all these years later. And what's going on in Ukraine today and in the last, since the end of the Cold War, supposedly all of these CIA programs ended in 1991, right? Because with the end of the
mm,
Soviet Union, why would we need to have these programs anymore? So officially they were
mm,
terminated. But I would argue, and I'm pretty sure I'm right, that it is continued, but it's all classified. And we probably won't know
yeah,
exactly what the CIA has been doing over there since 1991 for many, many years to come, right? It may not even be in our
yeah,
lifetimes. It may be 50 years from now when we finally get those documents. So tell your kids and your grandkids to be on the lookout and to be vigilant and to press their government for declassification and release of what really happened in Ukraine because we won't know for many years to come.
yeah. So there was an article in the New York Times maybe a month ago, and they were boasting about how right after the 2014 Maidan coup, the CIA they helped the Ukraine, the intelligence set up a lot of things, the organizations, and to go spy into Russia. So the CIA has been very active in Ukraine for the last decade.
That's right. As a matter of fact, we found out quite a bit from a New York Times article that was published, I think it was in 2022, right after the war began, or right before the war began. And that article is actually quite good. I'll quote you from it. This part's really interesting. It referred to the U.S. setting up within Ukraine's borders, quote, a stealthy network of commandos and spies rushing to provide weapons, intelligence, and training. CIA personnel have continued to
Mm,
operate in the country secretly, mostly in the capital, Kiev, directing much of the massive amounts of intelligence the United States is sharing with the Ukrainian forces. And even though it's the New York Times, and I know a lot of people don't trust the mainstream media, and I don't either, I think the New York Times is actually a pretty good source on this because the New York Times has always been a mouthpiece for the intelligence community. So it's kind of a limited hangout.
yeah,
The intelligence community, they have great sources. The intelligence community will only tell them so much, though, and they also feed them a lot of disinformation too. So you're never really sure what to
yeah,
believe. But I think that is accurate because it's just a continuation of the exact same thing that the CIA had been doing in Ukraine since 1947, since the very beginning of the agency's
yeah,
existence.
yeah. And the one thing that makes it now more difficult to find a lot of the truth is that the CIA has privatized a lot of its the efforts.
Yes, good point.
So yeah, so they would like work with some private organization to set up bioweapons labs, or they would work with George Soros to do the color revolution. So then those private organizations, they don't have to reveal the information. There's no Freedom of Information Act that we can use with these private organizations.
That's a great point. And there was something I wanted to share before we wrap up, even though it's difficult to talk about. I think it really drives home the point of how evil these Ukrainian nationalists were. People might dismiss what the CIA did working with these guys as, oh, they were just freedom fighters and, maybe they weren't so bad. And, the Soviets were worse, the communists were worse, so it's all okay as long as it's in the guise of fighting communism. But I want to read you a couple of things here before I go. Mykola Lebed, who I talk about quite a bit in my series, Hidden History Revealed, I just want to share with you how evil this guy was. He was probably the highest ranking Ukrainian Nazi war criminal that we ever brought into the United States. He was also, I think, on the top 10 most wanted war criminals by the Soviet Union. During World War II, Mykola Lebed did these leaflet propaganda campaigns that encouraged the extermination of Jews in Ukraine and Poles and Russians. And I'm going to read you a few quotes here of what these leaflets read. This is what got the local population stirred up so that they would also take part in these horrible slaughters and pogroms and the Holocaust. He warned the Jews in Lvov. One of these leaflets said, quote, "You welcomed Stalin with flowers when the Soviets occupied East Galicia in 1939. He said, we will lay your heads at Hitler's feet," meaning we will behead you and put your heads at Hitler's feet. And it says that the Jews, quote, "have to be treated harshly. We must finish them off. Regarding the Jews, we will adopt any methods that lead to their destruction." And indeed, the pogroms in East Galicia in the early days of World War II killed perhaps, by the best estimates, around 12,000 Jews. And let me read you a little bit more. I know this is difficult to hear, but you kind of need to hear it to let it fully sink in, the level of evil that we're dealing with. For example, in November 1944, when the Soviets were pushing westward and winning the war and they reconquered East Galicia, there were only a few Jews there that were still left alive. And local historians, this is from a local historian's report, that, quote, "When the Bandera gangs seize a Jew, they consider it a prize catch. The ordinary Ukrainians feel the same way. The villagers, they all want to participate in the, quote, heroic act of killing a Jew. They literally slash Jews to pieces with their machetes," unquote. It's incredible. And the whole idea, of course, and that includes the Poles too. Mykola Lebed proposed in April of 1943, and of course he would recruit the local population to help him do this, to, quote, "cleanse the entire revolutionary territory of the Polish population," so that a resurgent Polish state would not claim that territory as they had done in 1918. So they just wanted to wipe them out to make sure that they wouldn't be a threat in the future. And this is same historian Maltz recorded that, quote, "Bandera men are not discriminating about who they kill. They are gunning down the populations of entire villages. And since there are hardly any Jews left to kill, the Bandera gangs have turned on the Poles. They are literally hacking Poles to pieces. Every day, you can see the bodies of Poles with wires around their necks floating down the river Bug. On a single day, July 11th, 1943, the UPA attacked some 80 localities, killing perhaps 10,000 Poles. That's shocking.
Wow.
Absolutely shocking.
Wow.
And, the Bandera gangs would hide out in the woods, armed to the teeth, and hold up Soviet soldiers. The Soviets, it says, may be the rulers of the towns, but the Bandera gangs reign supreme in the surrounding countryside, especially at night. It says the Russians have their hands full. Hardly a day passes without a Soviet official being killed. And that was true. There was very fierce fighting between these, Ukrainian partisans in the western part of Ukraine who were ambushing the Soviet soldiers as they were moving westward towards Berlin in the final days of the war. They were not giving up without a fight. And they did indeed put up
Mm.
one hell of a fight. One more thing I wanted to
Wow.
recommend, if you're curious to learn more, there's a book I would recommend, and it's free. Anybody can read it. Anybody can download it. It's like a summary of some of the most important documents that were declassified in the early 2000s under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, which was the source for most of my work. But there's a free ebook called Hitler's Shadow, and it was published in 2010 by the US National Archives. You can get it at the National Archives website at archives.gov, I believe. And it's a terrific book. It's a pretty quick and easy read. I think it's less than 100 pages or so. And it's like a summary of the documents, because I know that not everyone has the time to, go dig through hundreds of thousands of documents. So the National Archives did the work for you. And the book is called Hitler's Shadow, Nazi War Criminals, U.S. Intelligence, and the Cold War. And there's a chapter,
Mm.
it's kind of divided into chapters, right? There's a chapter on our collaboration with the German Nazis. There's a chapter on our collaboration with the Banderites, Ukrainian Nazis. And there's also, and this is kind of timely right now with the war in Gaza going on, a very fascinating chapter, which we didn't even get into tonight, about our collaboration with Nazis in the Middle East.
Mm.
That is another story for another day, but that's a fascinating chapter
Mm.
of the book as well. And maybe we can do a future space about that. And I'm currently working on a really
Yeah.
interesting episode. Actually, my next episode of the podcast of Hidden History Revealed is going to be about the Nazi war criminals from Germany and Ukraine and Belarus who escaped to the Middle East right after World War II to find safe haven there in places like Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and joined forces with the local revolutionaries there to then invade the newly formed state of Israel and fight against them in the 1948 War of Independence. That's fascinating.
Wow.
Have you ever seen the movie Exodus? The famous 1960 movie with
Yeah.
Paul
Yeah.
Newman.
Yes.
There's a scene
Yes.
in that
Absolutely.
movie. I don't know if you remember this scene. It's actually one of the most interesting scenes in the movie. They didn't expand on this much in the plot, but do you remember the scene where the German Nazi is there at one of the local Arabs' house? The Arab who was friendly to the Jews, didn't want to fight them, wanted to make peace with them. This German Nazi who was affiliated with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Ajamin al-Usani, whom I've written about at great length. He and the Mufti were collaborating to get these Arabs all riled up to go kill all these Jews in Israel or Palestine, depending on how you
Mm.
looked at it. This was just as, it was right on the verge of Israel becoming a state, of getting statehood at the United Nations. And that's one of the most fascinating scenes in that film. I just watched Exodus again recently for the first time in years. And after all the work I've done going through these Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act documents, that scene never really grabbed me before. But this time when I watched the
Mm.
movie, oh, it all made sense. It made perfect sense. At that moment, I was like, yep, that's exactly what happened. That's actually true. And here was this Nazi war criminal on the run, hiding out in Palestine, planning to kill himself a lot more Jews. That's what he was there to do. And the character in the film, the Arab Palestinian who was friendly and wanted to make peace with the Jews and was friendly with Paul Newman, they'd been boyhood friends, and um,
Mm.
they had him killed. He was, hung out in front of his house. You might remember the scene in the film where they find him hanging from a rope with a swastika tattooed on or drawn on his chest as a way of saying the
Mm.
Nazis were here. We're still here and we haven't gone away. And you didn't catch us all and you didn't prosecute all of us. And,
Mm.
really, when you think about Nuremberg in the final analysis, I wouldn't call it a show trial. It was important to have Nuremberg, but not nearly enough were prosecuted. I think in the end, only 27 convictions were actually won. 27 out of
Wow.
millions and millions of Nazis. And they all
Yeah.
scattered, and many of them, continued to remain in West Germany and Western Ukraine, and later in the United States, Canada, and South America, Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, until the days they died. And most of them never faced accountability.
And some became the chief of NATO and the chief of German
Yes,
intelligence.
exactly right. Exactly right. Yes. So the ideology lived on. Even though, we think
Yeah.
about it, most people think about it and they go, oh, well, we defeated Nazism. It's no longer a threat. We defeated Germany. We denazified Germany. And yes, we did. And today, Germany is one of the democracies, of the great democracies of Europe. And the way they did that, of course, was outlawing all kinds of Nazi propaganda. You couldn't have a copy of Mein Kampf. You certainly couldn't display any Nazi flags or symbols or anything like that, at least not in public. So the Nazis had to go underground. And the problem was, though, with that, you couldn't stamp out the ideology. You couldn't kill that.
Mm,
And remember, they only denazified Germany. Denazification was a process that didn't take place in places like Ukraine, in Belarus, and in the Middle East. You know, it
mm,
continued to fester, and especially in the Middle East, Haj Amin al-Assani, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, was hired by the Nazis during the war. He spent most of the war in Berlin, where he did radio broadcasts to the Middle East to get the Arabs all flamed up to go kill Jews, right? And
mm,
the Nazi ideology was very popular in the Arab world for obvious reasons. And they were heavily propagandized. Translated copies in Arabic of Mein Kampf were widely distributed throughout Arabia, certainly in Egypt and
mm,
Palestine and Syria and Lebanon. And so after the war, the Middle East was never denazified. And so much of that
mm,
ideology continued to flourish and fester. And it has a direct tie to where we are right now. The Muslim Brotherhood was very enthusiastic collaborators with Hitler. They were
mm,
collaborating with Hitler in the 1930s before the war. They collaborated with Hitler during the war. After the war, they continued to say that Hitler's great. We love Hitler. Even today, until recently, when the IDF destroyed it, there was a chain of clothing stores in Gaza City. Hitler. The store is literally called Hitler. There was Hitler 1 and Hitler 2. It was such a popular store, they had two of them in Gaza City, where you could, where young men of fighting age would buy their battlefield clothing so that they would look cool. They'd buy their keffiyehs. And Mein Kampf is still a bestseller in the West Bank. I think last time I looked, it was like number 6 on the bestseller list. So that ideology is alive and well in Hamas, in the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's a very, very old tie that goes back long before World War II. Haj Amin al-Assani was making his alliance with Hitler as early as 1933, as soon as the Nazis came to power in Germany. He saw an obvious, common goals. And it's also interesting, I'll point this out before I go, that the reason that the Arabs, and particularly what we now call the Palestinians, back then we called them the Palestinian Arabs, um, they allied themselves with Hitler and Nazi Germany for the exact same reasons that the Ukrainians did, the Ukrainian nationalists. The
mm,
Arab nationalists had the same goals as the Ukrainians. They wanted two things. One, they wanted to exterminate or run every Jew out of Palestine, and they were big on the extermination part. Number two, they wanted sovereignty. They wanted an an independent Arab state of Palestine, which is exactly the same thing that the
Mm.
Ukrainians wanted. They wanted their own sovereign and independent Ukrainian state outside of the Soviet Union. So they had the same goals in doing so. And there are lots of parallels that are just fascinating. And we'll talk about those another time. But that's the short version of a very long story.
Okay. All right. Wow. So, Lori, thank you so much. It's very, very late for you. And I'm sure a lot of people would like to ask questions, but it's very late for Lori. So we will let her go. But follow her on Twitter and feel free to ask her the questions on X. And I'm sure she'll be able to answer them tomorrow when she wakes up.
Thanks. And I've got a few minutes if anybody has a question. If you'd like to ask, I don't mind sticking around for another 10 minutes or so. I'm yeah, I'm good
Okay.
for a little bit longer and then I got to go to bed. But I'm always curious to hear what the
Oh,
audience thinks and if anybody has any questions. So fire away if you got one or two.
all right. So go ahead, Ishwar. You are on mute.
Yeah, I mean, this is very fascinating to hear. And I would just want to ask you about how Vatican and Switzerland, the funding agencies, all aligned against these. I mean, all aligned against USSR when they were to be, allies at that point of time. Still, they had this narcissism. So in US currently, if you see, the Zionist are the top notch of rulers right now. And how does this religious perspective that you brought in here plays out still now? Uh, because currently Zionist rules in US, and they have this Nazi elements as well. So when the Zionist was there in 1947 or 50s, how did they accommodate really about these Nazis in US, especially with Nicola coming into US?
Unfortunately, it sounded like his, I don't know, it might be a glitch with spaces, but I couldn't quite understand the question. It was kind of cutting in and out. Maybe SL can tell me the gist of the question. I didn't hear it all.
So I had the same problem as well, Ishwar. I think he wanted to ask about how the Vatican was able to work with the Nazis and also the Zionists in the U.S. Why did they let the CIA work with the Nazis?
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, I think I got the gist of the question there. Sorry, sometimes spaces glitches like that. And when a speaker comes up, sometimes I can't hear the speaker at all, or they're kind of cutting in and out. So I'm sorry about that, Ishwar. Um, the Vatican connection is particularly fascinating because you can trace that back all the way to 1918 and the Bolshevik Revolution, and it sent shockwaves throughout Europe, especially in Poland and in Germany, where the Catholic Church was very strong, in Italy. And of course, they were starting to ally themselves with this growing fascist movement, which would later materialize in Mussolini coming to power and the rise of fascism in Italy. But so much of that, the Catholic Church had a role to play. The Vatican had a role to play in their minds. I don't think they quite, they stayed neutral throughout the war. The Catholic Church never quite ever condemned the Nazis or Nazism because they were actively collaborating with them. They were terrified of communism, terrified of Bolshevism, and it was personal for them. The Catholic Church was willing to do whatever it took to defeat communism. And there are some fascinating books about that, documents that you can read about the early collaboration of the Catholic Church, even before the Nazis came to power in Germany, how they were putting their money, their resources into fighting the Bolsheviks, to trying to stop them. And of course, there was also the question of religious persecution in the Soviet Union and this establishment of a secular society and getting rid of religion and all that. Of course, the Catholic Church felt threatened by that as well. So that's something really interesting to look into. As far as the Zionist influence in the United States, it was part of the Nazi propaganda. You can go back and read a lot of Hitler's speeches and the old Nazi propaganda in Germany and elsewhere, but especially in Germany, where they talk all the time about how Roosevelt was controlled by the Jews. He was controlled by the Zionists, and supposedly Stalin was too, which was ridiculous. But that was the Nazi line. It was how they got the populace stirred up to go kill Jews, was to tell this old blood libel that came straight out of the protocols of the elders of Zion, that the Jews run the world and the Jews run the president of the United States, and that's why we have to fight the Americans, because Roosevelt, they knew Roosevelt wasn't a Jew, but a lot of his top advisors were. And the Zionist project really didn't have, as far as I can tell, not much influence over Roosevelt. I think those were lies being told by the Nazis. Obviously, the Nazis lied a lot about that sort of thing. But it is true that once Roosevelt died and Truman became president, that's when the lobby, the Zionist lobby, of course, they were trying to get their own state after the war, after the Holocaust. They felt like there was no safe place for them in Europe. I mean, just because the war was over certainly didn't mean that the Jews were safe. They weren't. They weren't safe in Germany. They weren't safe in Poland. They were still being killed. They were still suffering pogroms. The end of the war didn't mean the end of their nightmare. They still needed some place to go. And the Zionist project really picked up steam, of course, after World War II. There's a saying, and I think there's a lot of truth in it, that Israel didn't happen because of the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened because there was no Israel. And what that means is the Jews had no place to escape. During the Holocaust, even before the Holocaust, they were turned away from the United States, from Canada, from so many countries when they were trying to get out of Europe. It's like the doors of the world were closed to them. It was a very anti-Semitic, unfortunately, America was a very anti-Semitic country. So was Canada. We should have been taking them in. We should have been giving them safe harbor and refuge, and we failed to do that. We failed them. So they had no place to go. And that was, of course, what convinced the world to vote at the United Nations on that partition plan, and then later on the statehood of Israel, to give them that safe harbor in Palestine and to make that the new state of Israel. But yeah, it was more of a Truman thing than Roosevelt. Truman was influenced by, actually, it was Benjamin Netanyahu's father. He
Yeah,
was
he
one
was
of the
Polish.
prime.
Benjamin Netanyahu has Polish, ancestry.
That's right. I mean, Netanyahu himself was born in Tel Aviv, but his father was Polish. And he was one of the, the major lobbyists in 1946, 47, 48, lobbying members of Congress and President Truman to back this Zionist project and the creation of the State of Israel. So that's kind of really where it began. It's interesting to note that FDR was not crazy about the idea of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, because there was already talk about maybe doing that after the war, as the war was winding down, while Roosevelt was dying. Obviously, he had bigger problems on his mind. He was trying to win the war in Europe and trying to win the war in the Pacific. And I think creating a new Jewish state in Palestine was the furthest problem from his mind. But he did talk about it with some of his advisors. And, there were some, in his cabinet that were trying to convince him to support that at the United Nations when the United Nations was created, his dream of the United Nations. And, FDR, he didn't completely oppose it, but he thought, and I think he may have been right, that it was a big mistake because it was only going to antagonize and inflame the tensions between the Palestinian Arabs and the Jews in Palestine. He thought that it could only lead to trouble in the future. And boy, was he right about that, because it's been nothing but war and constant trouble ever since. And here we are again, fighting another war over it right now in the Middle East.
Yeah, on connection with that, I have to ask you another important question regarding how U.S. aligned with the Middle East to have the petrodollar, petrodollar kind of system right now they have. So, how do you think? I mean, that's the major reasons that why U.S. is most powerful country right now with 800 plus military of their country, and as well as in military bases of their country, plus this petrodollar. So, how do you think in that point of time when Nazis were having involved in heavily inflicted in the Middle East, having ties with the the Saudi and the Qatari, the all these Middle East countries, how did that enroll here? How do you see that?
That's a great question. I could talk about that all night. I've been doing a lot of reading on that lately because I didn't even know this until fairly recently. And again, I have to credit the work of John Loftus, the great, DOJ historian and Nazi hunter who brought us the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act and all these documents that we have today. He wrote a book that I recommend. It's called The Secret War Against the Jews. And these documents back him up. What a lot of people don't realize, and we see it playing out right now, is that the United States since 1948 has had a two-faced foreign policy in the Middle East. And I'll try and make this as short and simple as I can because I know that we haven't got unlimited time. We've always had this two-faced foreign policy. On paper, we stand with Israel, right? We're an ally of Israel. We sell arms to Israel, and supposedly we're on their side. Yet, at the same time, we have supplied vital intelligence and money and often gotten into bed with terrorist groups, radical jihadists and Islamists. We created Al Qaeda. We created Osama bin Laden, again, all under the guise of fighting communism, right? During the first Afghan war back in the 70s. It was always done under the guise of fighting commies. But, this has been the real truth of it. If I could boil it down real simple, is this. The reason why the United States has betrayed Israel so many times in our supposed alliance, well, there's two reasons. Number one, there's always been a very anti-Semitic undercurrent at the State Department. Even before World War II, back in the days when, after the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, that's one of the reasons that we cut our diplomatic ties and we became enemies and had a Red Scare in the 1920s, was there was this belief that, all Jews were communists and communists were evil. And all communists were, all Jews were communists. And so there was this very anti-Semitic sentiment, especially in the State Department. And after the war, a lot of those really anti-Semitic guys were still in the State Department, and they were fighting the idea of the creation of Israel. They didn't want it. They wanted to let the Arabs go over there and slaughter every Jew in Palestine. They were rooting for it. So the long and short of it is this. We betray Israel because Israel doesn't have oil. And the Arabs have lots and lots of oil. We've never wanted to piss them off too much. We want to keep things friendly with them because we need that oil. And it's really all about the oil. Every war we've waged over there and it has been about the oil. And our foreign policy to this day is still about the oil. So we can smile to Israel's face and sell them some weapons and say that we love you, but at the same time, we're double dealing behind their backs with their enemies. And wouldn't you expect that from the CIA? I mean, that's where we started in this space in 1945, where we betrayed our ally, the Soviet Union, with Nazis, with their enemies. And we're literally stabbing them in the back while smiling to their face. And unfortunately, that seems to have always been the way of the United States and British intelligence. It's just what we do, and it's what the Britons did with the Balfour Declaration, and throughout the entire British mandate there in Palestine. Is they were double dealing too. They were promising the Jews and the Arabs things that they had no intention of delivering to both parties.
That's what US is doing with Pakistan and India as well. On
Yes.
paper, they are friendly with India, but in reality, they support Pakistan terrorists and Pakistan, all this kind of terrorist organization that is out there.
Boy, that is so true. Another perfect analogy. Great point. Great point.
And you mentioned.
Okay, cool.
Sorry.
Well, Ishwar, so we need to let Lori go. It's very, very late for her back in the US.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so
I
we will
appreciate
bring
you.
Lori
Great
back.
questions.
Yeah, so we will bring Lori back when she's free again, and then we'll do a part 2 of this.
I would love to. We'll do it when I'm a little more awake. It's almost we're coming up to midnight here, Central Time in the United States. So I apologize if I was a little bit foggy on some dates and names and stuff like that, but it is getting pretty late. I hope I did okay.
Yes, it was. It was just fantastic. We learned so much.
Thank you. I enjoy this. I love talking about it.
Okay, thank you very much, Lori, and so have a wonderful night. So people follow Lori, and if you have any questions, then feel free to ask her on Twitter X, and we will see Lori back again in the future.
And I hope if you enjoyed this space that you'll check out my Hidden History Revealed podcast, which really takes you in depth into these documents. I'll show you the documents. I'll walk you through the entire history. It's 3 episodes so far. I'm working on episode 4 right now. That'll be the one about the Middle East, which is going to be fascinating. But the first 3 episodes cover our CIA alliance with the Nazis in Germany, in Ukraine, and in Belarus. And also tells you the story of John Loftus and how the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act became a thing. Because if it wasn't for that one law, we wouldn't know what we know today, and I wouldn't be able to tell you this story. So I put a link to the podcast down there in that purple pill, and you can also follow me on my YouTube channel at Real Lori Spencer on YouTube. Look me up. I'm also on Rumble at Lori Spencer, and all of those episodes are up on both my YouTube and my Rumble channels. You can also find me on Facebook at Real Lori Spencer. So I hope you guys will find me, and I hope you enjoy the podcast and all of my hard work that I've put into it. And thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you so much. Thanks to Sputnik India for hosting, and to you, SL, my friend, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely, Lori. So well, I hope you would write a book in the future.
I should. It seems like I've been doing all of this in podcast format and on Twitter and these threads, and articles. I blog about it. But yeah, this is enough for a good book. I think that book by the National Archives, Hitler's Shadow, is a great read. But my only complaint about it is it's too short. It's only about 100 pages, and this could easily be a 400 or 500 page in-depth book. So if I don't write it, somebody out there, I hope some historian will, because it really needs to be talked about in depth.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you very much, Lori, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Thank you again, everybody. I'll see you soon. We'll do this again, SL, for sure.
Okay. Sounds perfect, Lori.
To be continued.
Bye. Sure.
Good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.